Thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Katie Hanson.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all of you for being here on this unseasonably warm and beautiful afternoon. Kind of the perfect day to talk about such beautiful and sunny pictures. When we think of Impressionism, we likely think of something like this, with its visible brushstrokes, its light, bright palette, and an easy-to-enjoy scene of France. And likely we think of Claude Monet. Monet, in his lifetime and now, is the exemplar of Impressionism. Since this 10-week course offers many fresh perspectives on Impressionism, we thought that offering a session covering some basics of Impressionism, with a special focus, of course, on the MFA's own collection, would be a helpful building block. The works you're looking at now are by Pissarro, Monet, Sisley, and Renoir, and with one exception, they were all made in the 1870s and 1880s, the heyday of Impressionism in France. These are plein air paintings. They're painted outdoors. They show local scenery and natural light. They have a great sense of immediacy. What do I mean by immediacy? I mean that they look like they might be rapidly observed and rapidly made. I also, when I think about immediacy, I think about the sense of the individual's distinctive brushstroke, and the choice of places and spaces dear to the particular artist. Today, we'll begin with landscape, no surprise here, and with a focus on Monet, before moving into the slightly thornier topic of figural painting. I also need to mention that while these seem so familiar and easy to see now, experimentation in ways of seeing and in modes of display are part and parcel of Impressionism, as is a certain technical innovation. Tubes. Metal tubes like these only became available in 1841. Previously, paints had been stored in a slightly more organic fashion, as you see here. When paint in tubes became available, it was, as you might imagine, expensive. New things tend to be. But by the 1870s, paint in tubes were readily accepted and quite widely used. They were very popular among artists. It might be obvious to state, but paint in tubes is a great innovation for a variety of reasons, not least of which being the artist can go to the colorman's shop and buy a whole bunch of colors. So it's less labor intensive to have to grind and mix and prepare so many different colors if you can just go buy them already made in tubes. The other thing is that it's a lot more portable. So what you're seeing on the left here is paint stored in an animal bladder. It's all tied nice and tightly closed with some string, a little bit of cord there. And then a box with various bladders of paint in it. Now, if you can imagine going on a little trip to paint outdoors, what a mess that might be if one of those bladders popped. Metal tubes are a little more predictable and portable in that way. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind is if you want to get at that paint in that bladder, you got to poke it with a tack and then squeeze it to get some paint out. How do you close it again? So super helpful to have a nice cap on a metal paint tube. I know I'm belaboring this a bit, but it is hugely important, and in fact, you don't have to just take my word for it. Someone you may have heard of, who was a close colleague of Monet, a certain fellow called Pierre-Auguste Renoir, had to say, "Without colors in tubes, there would be no Cézanne, no Monet, no Pissarro, and no Impressionism." Case closed. These paintings are, of course, not in the MFA's collection. They're not on view here at this time. I'm showing them to you for a couple of reasons, one of which is I love this painting of the young Monet with his palette in hand because you can see how many different colors are on the palette. So that thing I was just saying about how much more convenient it is for an artist if they can open and close a tube and just buy a tube at the paint shop to have lots of colors on the palette. So that extraordinary range of hues and colors that we see in their pictures, and then also seeing him standing out in the garden with an easel and a small canvas, his box of colors, his palette in hand, probably painting these flowers. So this sense of how he worked, of the scale of the signs of canvas that he's working on at an easel outdoors. And I confess to you, I love to think about him this way, set up just like in this painting, when I'm looking at paintings that he made. So perhaps you wish to think of him that way as well. And so here are two paintings that are in the MFA's collection. And so imagining him with his easel and these, small canvas set up, a box of paint in tubes, anywhere that he might wish to paint. And these are places of personal interest. And I realize that this map doesn't project super well to the back of the room, but there's Paris, and this blue squiggle is the River Seine going out to the coast here. And Monet grew up in Le Havre, here this gray spot. He also lived in Argenteuil, which is just outside of Paris. Giverny is likely a familiar word for you, and right there you're going to hear about Vétoil a couple of times. So just a few places along the Seine as we're talking through a variety of things. I also want to mention, as you're looking at these ships in a harbor, it's not a ship that won a battle. They're just any old ships in the harbor, likely at Le Havre. And as you're looking at the Seine at Lavacour is right across the river from Vétoil, where Monet was living. You might notice there's some quirky vegetation in the water. That vegetation is not hiding baby Moses in a basket. There are no river nymphs or goddesses swimming in this water. It's just the regular old Seine with regular old greenery. And I love that you all laughed. It makes me really happy. And it's an important thing to remember that Impressionist paintings don't expect of us a knowledge of literature or of religion or of ancient history in order to appreciate their subjects. They don't really tell stories. They are of their moment, but they are of a moment. And that, I think, is part of their enduring pleasure, is that immediacy that they have. So as I was saying, these ships are probably ships in the port harbor at Le Havre, where Monet grew up, right there on the Normandy coast. And as you're looking at this, it's one that I really love. And you'll see this use of unblended color, and that's really a hallmark of Monet's Impressionist work. And to my mind, and if you've heard me talk about Monet before, you already know that I think he's one of the greatest painters of watery surfaces. And one of the things I love about looking at his work, and this one is a particularly great one, is looking for this alla prima stroke, this way in which he hits the canvas and squiggles down, just alla prima, all at once. And it's just a squiggle of paint, and also so convincingly, it's the reflection of the mast of the ship on the rippling, moving surface of the water. And that sense of immediacy, that sense of his touch, that sense of paint on the surface, and also that confident self-assurance that he must have to achieve those in just one little squiggly go. So that's something I love to look for in his work. And here is a closer, bigger view of the Seine at Lavacour, which is also on view here, though it is from a private collection, as noted on the screen. And this is a location that was dear to Monet. He's living across the river from this particular spot. He's painting his surroundings, the things he sees day to day. And he's giving us a great attention to a specific location, the way the river turns, and we're looking upstream toward Paris. These quirky little kind of sandbars with some vegetation growing in the center of the river itself, and even the specific kind of distinctive local architecture. We really get a sense of a specific place, but without the need for meticulous detailing, meticulous rendering to really get that sense of location. He lived in Vétoy from 1878 to 1881. We happen to have 3 paintings of Vétoy here. And these 3 help me remember a few other characteristic aspects of Impressionism that I wish to mention. So, of course, I've just been talking about the painting of water, the sort of rippling effects of light on the surface, the momentary and moving quality. And then looking here at flowers, and if you asked Monet, it was not water that made him want to paint. It was perhaps a flower that made him a painter. But that love of the seasons, and having these 2 side by side, the sense in which the changing of the seasons, the changing of light and of weather, can make the familiar look new, the familiar look beautiful and strange and interesting and compelling time and time again for making a work of art. These 4 paintings by Sisley are all on view right now, and while they're not explicitly the seasons, I always think of them that way, that sense of the importance of times of year, that for the sake of visual interest, making a familiar location look different in differing effects of light and weather. And this is not the sort of traditional way of doing the seasons with an allegorical embodiment of a season or a labor associated with a season. This is just the beauty of local scenery and light and weather. And I also realize while I'm on this slide, I neglected to mention, instead of putting MFA Boston every time when it's a painting that's in the MFA Boston collection, I put the object's identification number, its accession number. So if you wish to find it again later, those are the numbers that make them quick to search on our website. And another part of Impressionism that's so important and that makes it so pleasurable to look at is that it's often showing us spaces of leisure. So what we're seeing here are, one vacation painting of Italy, but otherwise paintings that Renoir made in France. Chatou is just outside of Paris, a little bit, it's in between Paris and Bougival, another place that people went for dancing, for walking in the countryside. So this sensibility of interest in the local, in the here and now. I offer you these installation shots from the galleries on the second floor here at the MFA, paintings by Monet, by Sisley, and by Renoir. And you likely notice that they're all pretty similar in size. So another thing that we need to keep in mind is the availability of standard size stretchers for canvas. So this scale of picture that is sort of repeated over and again as something that's available to them, and also conveniently they can tuck under their arm if they wish to go outdoors to paint. And another aspect of this scale, this size of work, is that it's domestic. You can kind of imagine having this in a home, and you don't have to live in a castle to have room for it. So that's certainly another aspect, the sort of domestic size of their pictures. These three artists, Sisley, Monet, Renoir, met each other in the 1860s when they were art students in Paris. And they had a really tough time getting their paintings to be shown at the official government-sponsored and juried exhibition called the Salon in Paris. And that was the way that an artist really made his or her name at that point, was by being shown in one of these large exhibitions that had, art critics coming to it and had a brochure with everyone's name and even the address of their studio in it. Who was a participant. In the official salon, and I'm showing you two installation shots, one a photograph, the other a drawing here, works were stacked high and crowded together. So even if an artist had his or her work accepted by the jury, it might be tough for them to make an impact. You can imagine a little painting getting rather lost in there, or even a painting of a medium size might be really quite difficult to see if it were up very high. So there were challenges even if you got in. It still wasn't a sure thing that you were going to be recognized. And for Monet, and I give you the kind of style that was more typical of the things being accepted at the Salon, this very finely finished and idealized kind of bodies and shading and modeling, and then a sense of the size of this this kind of painting to be shown in these spaces. So Monet and Renoir were having a really hard time in the 1860s trying to get their work even accepted by the jury, to then be shown at the Salon, to then be seen by folks if they could find it in all of this. So they had an idea, and that idea was that they would join together and have an exhibition of their own, an independent exhibition. And they got together with like-minded friends, and they organized their own exhibition outside of that jury system, outside of that kind of huge space that was the Salon. In 1874, the artists joined together with the idea of a bakers' union, such that each participant would pay dues, and they would use those dues to be able to pay for a space and pay for a little pamphlet to be published for their exhibition. And these like-minded folks did this 8 times between 1874 and 1886. And each time it was a slightly different cast of characters. Some people were more constant about showing with the group than others. And what I'm offering a selection of works from the MFA's collection by some of the more acclaimed participants in those Impressionist exhibitions. Unfortunately for me, there are no known photographs of the installation of an Impressionist exhibition. We know what was shown thanks to the little pamphlets that they had published, and also thanks to descriptions in letters, the artists writing back and forth about how to install the space, about what they're going to include that year, about who's participating, so we get some of the gossip and some of the texture of what that must have been like. And then, of course, also critics writing about the exhibition, so we get a sense for what the spaces would have been like and what artworks were there. And one of the things that is poignant in reading back how they wished to display their own art was that they didn't want to have more than 2 paintings high. So either a single row or a double hang, but no higher than that, and with breathing room between the works of art so that things could really be seen. And you'll notice in the upstairs galleries that we make a little nod to that in the display, with the Monet gallery in a single or at most double hang with small scale of paintings, and in a neighboring room, works that were made for salon-type display in a salon-type very high hang. You may also have observed when I was showing this a moment ago that in 1874, when they first exhibited together, they called themselves the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. They didn't call themselves the Impressionists, so what's that about? You've probably heard this story before, and there are different facets to it. But one of these sort of art historically famous and pivotal works is Impression Sunrise, which is one of the works that Monet contributed to that first, now what we call Impressionist exhibition in 1874. And why did he call it Impression Sunrise? In an uncharacteristic moment, he's very helpful in this regard, and he says, I had sent a thing, thanks, Claude. I had sent a thing done in Le Havre from my window of the sun in the fog with some ship's masts. They asked me for a title for the catalog. It couldn't really pass for a view of Le Havre, so I replied, put impression. These two paintings were both in the 1874 Impressionist exhibition, so I love having them side by side because one of them could pass for a view of Le Havre, and he does call that one Le Havre fishing boats, and this other one couldn't really pass for a full-scale view, so call it impression. And in the parlance of the time, an impression was a quick notation of an atmospheric effect. And so, indeed, it is a quick notation of fog and some, masts of ships, things of that nature, and does look rather different side by side with this other thing by the same artist. He's so great. So for an artist to paint something loosely rendered and quickly observed was not in and of itself entirely new, but to exhibit such a work was a bold and innovative statement. And these artists were valorizing their first impression as their immediate response as something worthy of sharing with the world. In the past, something so quickly and loosely made might have served the artist as something to keep in the studio, to use in service of making something larger and more finely, tightly finished, a more finished-looking thing. So I offer you this grouping of works, all of which are in the MFA's collection. So here's an artist who means to cater to the expectations of the salon and the salon's kind of jury. And so he has made these loosely painted sketches and studies, but these were in the service of making a much larger scale, more tightly finished painting of the same subject. And so I've included, I know it's a lot of writing on the screen, but just to give you a sense, 7 by 9 inches versus 124 by 129 inches. So this slide up here is not to scale. The little one on the top is smaller than this, and the big one on the side, 2 of me. I hope that helps. So this idea of making, this would, of course, not be an impression because it's not an atmospheric effect, but an esquisse, a sketch of some sort, in the service of then making a tableau, something that is a work of art, a finished thing to share with one's audiences. He wouldn't have exhibited these as independent works of art. That's not to say that Monet never did that kind of thing. He sometimes would make a smaller version of a thing en plein air and then take it back to the studio and make a larger, more finely finished version. It doesn't look like this, of course, but it is a more tightly rendered version. Here's my favorite Monet lie. When asked by someone when he was living in Vetoy, right, which is where he painted this, if a guest could come visit him in his studio, he said, "My studio? but I've never had one, and I don't understand how anyone could shut themselves into a room. Of course, he painted en plein air outdoors plenty of times, but not every single time all the time. And so this is my favorite Monet lie. We're all allowed a few, and that's his. Indeed, the painting that's in Dallas now is a studio painting, and he made it based on sketches that were made outdoors. And it's important to keep in mind, Monet is very successful later. But in the 1870s, he's struggling to sell his landscape paintings, and he's struggling to sell things from the Impressionist exhibitions. And so he does sometimes try making a thing and submitting it to the salon, showing it at that official government-sponsored juried exhibition. And in this particular case, he submitted this one, and it got accepted, and then it got skied. It was hung like above this, if you can imagine, right? So how's anyone going to see it? So he tried, but continued to experience frustrations in that regard. I should say that this practice of sometimes making a sketch or a study or an impression outdoors and then using it later in the service of another work of art was something that Monet had done for a while. And this is especially useful in the context of our current exhibition, which has this, if I may, extraordinarily beautiful pastel. I absolutely love it, which he made outside with pastels and then brought back to his studio and used it to help make an oil painting with a similar sort of sunset sky. And I'll let you look at the dimensions of these two things and the dates of their making on the screen there. So this practice of sometimes making something outdoors and then repurposing it in the studio to help himself with another composition was something he did early on particularly, but we see over and again. So I don't want to stress too hard that this is not an Impressionist practice. It is sometimes. There are two pastels by Monet made when he was in his 20s and that are in our current exhibition over in Gallery 155. And we don't know if he ever exhibited these small pastels. They're both signed, and we know that he kept them until the 1890s before he sold them. But we also know that on the occasion of that first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, he showed 8 pastels, and here they are listed in the catalog. Oh, sorry, 7. And they're just called croquis, sketch, and that's all we know. So we don't actually know which 7 pastels he showed that year. So sometimes I like to daydream that these could have been among them, but we don't actually know. What we do know is that the Impressionists exhibited works that were considered sketches, croquis, or impressions in their own exhibitions. Some critics really praised them for this. They were open to the idea of something new and fresh and innovative and different. And other critics were overtly hostile, and you may remember 2 weeks ago Jim Johnson reading a critic describing this as a study for wallpaper in its embryonic state. So they could be pretty colorful in their distaste for what they were seeing. Caricatures were also really common in the popular press, mocking all kinds of things, not just Impressionist painting. But I thought I would offer to you here to give you a sense for what Impressionism was like when it was new. So the one on the left there, you'll see it says Exhibition of Impressionist Painters on the doorway, and here is some sort of policeman with his hands up, "Whoa, stop," to this very pregnant-looking woman, and beneath it says, "Madam, that would not be prudent. Stay back from here." As though she might go into labor from the shock of seeing this embryonic wallpaper. The other one, these two fellows are having a conversation at the Impressionists, and the one facing us says, "What are you doing?" And the other responds, "I was told there was a lot of talent in this picture, so I'm looking to see if they displayed the wrong side." Yikes. All kinds of things got mocked in the newspaper in the late 19th century. It's part of the great fun of being a specialist in this particular period. You really can get a sense for the sort of tone of when these things were new. So where did they exhibit? I mentioned that they paid some dues like a baker's union so that they could rent a spot. And in 1874, the place that they exhibited was actually the studio of the very famous photographer Nadar on the Boulevard des Capucines in Paris. And this is Nadar's studio. You can sort of see his name there. So this is where the exhibition was in that particular year. And I offer you a Monet painting of the street outside this building. This was also shown in that 1874 exhibition. And when we look at this in 2018, this might look like, oh, Paris. That just looks like Paris with those regular height buildings, those broad boulevards, a lot of people walking. That's some people hanging out the window, looking down at the street. That's familiar Paris. I have this romantic notion of Paris, right? I taught school there for a while. This is new Paris in 1874. This area was newly Haussmannized, and we heard about that in the last 2 weeks a little bit, that Paris took the shape that we are familiar with now in the middle of the 19th century. So those broad boulevards and the regular street lights and the cafe culture that goes with having those big sidewalks, that was brand new. That was super modern in the middle of the 19th century. So this is a neighborhood that's newly Haussmannized. It's an area that's full of energy. It's a commercial neighborhood, finance kind of center. So this is modern. This is new. This is novel. And in other years, the exhibition might take place in the gallery of Paul de Rondruel, the dealer who started to represent the Impressionists. Other years, they used the money that they all pitched in to rent an apartment to have the exhibition in. And I mention that to sort of reinforce that the spaces were domestic in scale because the paintings were domestic in scale, and there were also works on paper and the occasional sculpture, of course, but mostly it was paintings. And so spaces that were intimate in scale, and then works of art, of course, that are also intimate in scale. So I am reinforcing the modernity of this neighborhood to reinforce that what maybe doesn't look modern to 2018 eyes looked really modern in the 1870s about this picture. And many Impressionist paintings are characterized by modern scenes, modern kinds of subjects. So the Boulevards Saint-Denis in Argenteuil in winter, likely a familiar painting to many of you. It's a painting about commuting, right? I don't know how many of you ride the T, but maybe on a very snowy day, I know it's hard to think about with this beautiful 80 degrees and sunshine today, but just imagine back in your mind. When you get off the train, which is here, and you're walking home, and you're holding your umbrella because it's actively snowing, that's what's happening here. I mean, it's a commuting scene. And then, of course, spaces of leisure. So Bougival, a suburb of Paris that people went to this dance hall and enjoyed themselves. And of course, a dress that's the absolute height of fashion. We know that the on-trend color, I know they had that in 1882, 83 as well. The on-trend color for women's dresses this year was shrimp. It's cuter in French, crevette. But this kind of light pink color with the little red, you're never going to see it the same way again, shrimp. But it's that modern, it's that of its moment, the sort of dress that looks old-fashioned, of course, to us now, but in 1883, this was the height of fashion in terms of the cut and the color. So the modernity of these pictures is, I know I'm stressing it, but it's really important. Argenteuil, just about 15 minutes by train from Paris, Bougival a little further, but not much. So that sense of paintings that are innovative in their gestural paint handling and in their modern subjects. And so these things that we maybe take for granted now, I was trying to get the sort of depth back into their historical moment. This last week, I think that we were also hearing a lot about conventions in landscape painting. And so I also really want to draw your attention to the fact that, artists are trying out compositional devices that are different from that Franco-Italian tradition or even the Barbizon paintings that you learned about last week and the week before. And a major factor in being able to see the world, see France differently, was the impact of Japanese prints. And here are two examples of Japanese woodblock prints that have compositional devices that Monet admired and then borrowed. He tried them out for himself in seeing the world around him. So you'll notice that very broad sort of two turning bands. It's water and snow here, and it's snow and grass there. But that kind of broad turning roadway or waterway taking up a huge swath of space, and then the placement of flakes of snow on the surface of the canvas. I mean, representations of flakes of snow. But that really plays with your sense of surface and depth within the composition, is something that, and even that great interest in effects of weather on the same place was something that Monet was seeing in Japanese woodblock prints that he admired and trying out in his own work. I like these two together as well. These nasturtium flowers are like so close that they're out of focus, and then this little piece of land with poplar trees is so far that it's out of focus, and there's very little middle ground, and he's seeing prints that have something very close and very far, but relatively little attention to the space between. And he's trying that compositional device in his own work. Monet, as you likely know, was an avid collector of Japanese prints. So there he is in his dining room, and then a photo of how it looks now. And by the early 1860s, Japanese art, textiles, decorative objects proliferated in Europe and were very popular items for artists and others to collect. At the 1867 International Exposition in Paris, there was a Japanese pavilion that sparked even more widespread interest, and dealers started to crop up in Paris selling fans, selling prints, selling garments, all sorts of different things. And Monet was among those who was absolutely fascinated and who started to acquire a sizable collection, ending up with about 200 Japanese woodblock prints. So his interest in super vibrant colors and also experimenting with different compositional and perspectival techniques is informed by his admiration for Japanese aesthetics. And so this idea that he sees the world around him differently for having studied works of art, and hopefully that feels familiar to you. It certainly feels familiar to me. So here's a painting that's very frequently on view in our galleries, the seacoast at Trouville. It's on the Normandy coast, just a little south of Le Havre, if you're imagining back to that slightly out of focus map we looked at earlier. And so here's this painting of this funny little tree. And why do I call it a funny little tree? You look at its roots, and it's like barely holding on to the ground as it's being sort of blown in the wind. It's sort of deformed and misshapen by having been buffeted by the weather there. And then you have this band of grass and a band of water and a slightly different blue band of sky. And you can really imagine Monet with his easel kind of hunkering down in this windy coast and painting this unassuming little picture. And it's a really strange composition if we think back about expectations for the sort of Franco-Italian tradition that he's coming out of only slightly earlier, of having, trees as like a bracket on one side of the composition and then a deep dive into space, a perspectival space, looking back into a far distance that we can imagine accessing. Instead, he's blocked that central recession into space that might be expected by putting this goofy little tree right there. He could have just moved his easel 5 feet one way or the other, and then this goofy little tree could just politely be over here, right? But he's seeing the world differently through the lens of artwork he admires. And so you notice here's also a tree, right, dead center, and a work of art that has, a band of sky and a band of water and a band of land and another band of water. And so he's not copying this Japanese woodblock print, but he's certainly being inspired by it and seeing the world around him differently for seeing it in the context, through the lens of these Japanese woodblock prints. And it helps him sort of come up with new ways of seeing, new ways of composing. So making something that looks very uncomposed, like you just happened upon this goofy tree on the coastline, and maybe it was a totally spontaneous thing, but you kind of imagine that somewhere in his mind, having admired a work of art before that had that composition, might have pushed him to place his easel where he did and not 5 feet to the left or 5 feet to the right for something else. Having these two on the screen together, I must mention that the one is an oil painting, the Monet, and the other, the Hiroshige, is a woodblock print. So it's on paper, and it's about half the size of the oil painting. So I've played with scale a little bit on PowerPoint so you can see it better, but it's worth mentioning, sort of like I was mentioning the scale issues with Regnault. Of course, discussing Monet's fascination with Japanese art and culture here at the MFA likely brings to mind this distinctive painting. And this distinctive painting I put at this point in the talk, in part because we've been looking at landscapes and we've been looking at works that are attending to light and weather and at least looking sort of spontaneous, rapidly made. And this particular painting doesn't fit those criteria. So it challenges some of maybe what our expectations are for Impressionism. Certainly, there are figural paintings that fill what our expectations might be for Impressionism: natural light, outdoors, looking a little bit more sort of unposed, uncomposed. And these were likely painted outside. And Monet is painting Camille, his wife, in their garden, in their backyard in Argenteuil, a space that's familiar to them. He's friends with Renoir. This woman may be Camille Monet as well. We're not 100% sure, but she looks familiar between those two. And this sense of not in fact needing to know for sure if it's her or not, to enjoy the painting. This just sort of beautiful scene of someone relaxing outdoors. I like to, of course, bring back this. You sort of think she could be right there with this scene in his backyard in Argenteuil as he's set up painting. Another aspect of this composition, of course, people tend to look at people in a composition, but as you're looking at the painting itself, there's as much attention to the flowers as to the grass, as to the dress, as to the face. So Monet's not directing us where to look. He's not telling us something is more important than the other. There's sort of this all-over composition, which is quite characteristic of Impressionism. It does look a reasonable amount like his wife, so we can tell it's her. Here's a photograph of her. Sort of characteristic outfit and hairstyle of hers. So that sense of it being something near and dear to the artist. I don't know who that kid is. Camille and Claude Monet had 2 boys. One of them was born in 1867, so he's too old to be that kid. The other one was born in 1878. So for all we know many, many things about Monet paintings, we don't always know all of the things. If you happen to know who the kid is, please let me know. Phone a friend. Fast forward a little bit here. So this sense of, certainly we have figural paintings that fulfill all those things we've just been talking about Impressionism. They're domestic in scale, they look rapidly observed, they have all this natural light. And then we have works that don't fit those criteria. And I shifted the scale on the slide just to play up the point that La Japonaise and Danse Bougival are nearly life-size representations of people rather than being small paintings. There's also a really much greater degree of finish, a much more tightly rendered surface, which we've talked a lot about, and also this sense of this kind of overall treatment here, but with Renoir, this is more out of focus and this is more in focus, if you will, to direct your eye, to direct your attention, and that's also a different strategy in making a painting, and that makes it feel a bit more like a tableau and a bit less like an impression, and so. That sense of the momentary or fleeting is less so in these large-scale figure paintings, less or in fact no interest in natural light and weather, both of them looking quite posed, quite composed. Why did they do this? They're exhibition pictures. They are made for exhibition and to get your attention. For 2 different exhibitions, but that strategy, which they've learned from official traditions of making something really big and distinctive to stand out amongst the other works. So Monet exhibited this painting in 1876 at the second Impressionist exhibition. And it was a big virtuoso display of color, of his paint handling, and really, stood out there. A nearly life-sized figure painting is unusual in Monet's work, and really special to have in our gallery upstairs, where it stands out amongst the smaller scale landscape paintings with natural light, for which he's rightly best known. La Japonaise is not the only large-scale figure painting that he made. He made another one 10 years earlier of the same model. She's wearing a blonde wig this time. This is, she had dark hair. You saw her before in the garden. And in 1866, he had made this painting of a woman in a green dress, and he showed it at the official government-sponsored and juried salon, and he had a great success. He got good critical praise, and also someone bought it, a publisher bought it for a handsome price. So that was pretty exciting for him, and 10 years later, he's struggling a bit to sell, and so he said, "Since certain amateur reproached me for renouncing the figure, reminding me of the success obtained by the woman in the green dress, I made La Japonaise for one of our exhibitions." It was a strategy. It was a thing he tried, and there he is telling us what he was doing. He's not always the most helpful when it comes to telling us why he did something. So I'll give you a sense of a few things he said about these two paintings. With regard to Woman in the Green Dress, he said, "Madame Monet, my first wife, did indeed model for a woman with a green dress, and while I hadn't set out specifically to do a portrait, but merely a Parisian lady of the period, the resemblance is striking." Super. Thank you, Claude. So you won't be surprised when asked, while he was working on La Japonaise, what he was up to. He said, "I'm painting one of the famous actors' robes. It's superb to do. I was tempted by being shown a marvelous robe with some golden embroidery that was several inches thick. Look at the fabric." Okay, so when Monet is not helping me out, one of the great things to be able to do is, if a painting has been shown publicly when it was brand new, is to see what critics had to say. And reading lots of criticism, and some critics in 1876 did not like this painting at all. They did not understand what he was trying to do. They were really troubled by the placement of the face, and I don't mean hers. We're all together here. Okay, good. But one really stood out to me. One critic really stood out to me, and what he had to say was this. His most important picture is young woman trying on a Japanese theatrical robe. Please note that was not the title of the painting in the exhibition, but it gives you a sense that the critic knew what he was looking at. So I continue. She stands with an open fan in her hand at the height of her face and carries on, laughing, cheerily playing the role of the costume, turning her pretty Parisian face to enjoy the effect of this trailing gown. Okay, he still hasn't gotten me all the way there, but that one turn of phrase, cheerfully playing the role of the costume, made me want to know more about what she's wearing and what is the role of that costume. Monet already told us it was an actor's robe, which is true. And so speaking with my wonderful colleague, Sarah Thompson, who's curator of Japanese art here, she shared with me this Japanese woodblock print that tells the same story told on the uchikake kimono that Camille Monet is wearing. And the story is something like this. A samurai goes leaf peeping. This is perfect for October in Massachusetts. He's looking at maple leaves changing colors. He happens upon a beautiful woman by a body of water. This happens every time you go leaf peeping, am I right? They have some sake also, and he falls asleep. And in his slumber, a god appears to him and tells him that that beautiful woman is not what she seems. She's in fact a demon, and she's out to get him. So he wakes up and draws his sword, sees her reflection in the water, demon, and defends himself. So just at the moment of drawing the sword to defend himself. You notice I'm showing you a Japanese woodblock print that's significantly later in date, and that date helps me remind me to tell you that this particular play was not an independent play, this story I just told you. It was not an independent play on the kabuki stage until 1887, but it had been a subplot within other plays for a century prior to that. So we know that there were plays staged at that Universal Exposition in Paris in 1867, but we don't know if this was one of them. So while I would love to think that Camille Monet is enacting the role of the costume, we can't actually know if Monet knew the story or not. And again, that sense, it's really fun about being an art historian, that for all that we know a lot about Monet and we know a lot about this painting, we don't know all the things. So I don't know if she's just being theatrical or if she's in fact playing the role of the demon lady. Either way, we see that she's very overtly posing. She's not being herself. She's not wearing her clothes or even her own hair. So it's always more to think with. The Dance at Bougival was also an exhibition picture made specifically to capture attention at an exhibition. But in this case, it was not at one of the group exhibitions that the Impressionists held together, like La Japonaise was shown by Monet at the second Impressionist exhibition. In the 1880s, that dealer I mentioned before, Paul Durand-Ruel, started also hosting solo exhibitions for some of the artists he represented. And he let Renoir know that Renoir would have us in late fall, early winter of 1882, he let Renoir know that Renoir would have a solo show in the spring of 1883. And so he finished these large-scale paintings to be centerpieces for that exhibition. And that exhibition took place in Paris in the spring of 1883, and then at an affiliated gallery in London thereafter. Dance at Bougival's paint wasn't dry in time for Paris, so it went to London, but made as paintings for exhibition to really sort of showcase what he was about in that particular moment, and that was a slightly more refined and finished kind of paint handling. I got so excited I lost my place in my notes. I can't really talk about figural art and the Impressionists without talking about this troublemaker, Degas. And why do I call him a troublemaker? Because he's a distinctive case within the Impressionists. And so I offer you some familiar favorites from our galleries here. And he, of course, is an artist we associate with modern entertainments, with portraits, with works of art that showcase the human body, the figure. And you may or may not know about Edgar Degas, that he exhibited in 7 out of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, but he objected to the moniker Impressionists. He preferred realist, but we also want to be careful about that because, as we were talking about last time, realism, capital R, means a different thing with someone like Courbet or Millet, or so he's a little tricky in this regard. He was very much committed to modern life, something that we've talked about with Impressionism. He was interested in unusual compositions, unusual ways of cropping a subject. He's very much showing his distinctive brushwork, but he maintained studio painting. He maintained making preparatory drawings and working up a canvas much more in the way that we think of traditionally and less so in the way we think of when we think about somebody like Monet. I put these two side by side because they were both exhibited in that first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, and they really highlight just how different these two painters are. If you'll allow me an extremely long quotation, I'd love to read you something that was written by Émile Zola about Degas, and it sort of highlights how different and how distinctive Degas was as compared to the other Impressionists, and it's why I've come to him at the end of the talk here. You'll also notice from the mean-spiritedness of some of the quotation that Zola wasn't a huge fan. It's really long. Whoa. Okay, bear with me. He says, in short, Monsieur Degas alone has profited from the exhibitions devoted to the Impressionists, and the reasons thereof must be sought in the very nature of the talent he exhibits. Monsieur Degas has never been one of those persecuted at the official salons. He was admitted. He received a relatively prominent place. Only, since he is of a delicate artistic temperament and cannot impose himself by the power of his painting, ouch, the general public walked past his pictures without seeing them. Oof. Justifiably nettled by this, he quickly grasped how much he had to gain by membership of this little coterie where his refined and elaborate works could be seen and studied individually. And indeed, no sooner was he freed from the throngs of the salon than everyone hailed him and a circle of fervent admirers formed around him. That's not entirely true. We might add that the works of the other Impressionists, rather hastily put together, could only set off the precision of his finish. There, moreover, he could exhibit sketches, fragments of studies, the simple line work in which he excels, which would never have been admitted at the salon. It follows that Monsieur Degas is quite right to confine himself to the Impressionist exhibitions and never again set foot in the great bazaar of the salon, where the endless hubbub can do him no good at all. Again, I love the laughter. I think some of these passages of their own words, of the words of people who saw them in the moment, provide a sense of humor and a sense of comfort. Degas his art looks really different than Monet's art, and people saw that then too, and they were a little curious then too about how he fit in. So seeing that he's not really a salon painter, but he's not really the same kind of painter that Monet is, how does this all work, was something that was curious then, and I think I find is curious for folks now too. But again, this sense of his modernity, his interest in unusual cropping, and the way he challenges expectations in all kinds of different ways. So I have these two up side by side because the top one, of course, conforms to what Zola was just saying about fine details and line works and the sort of fussiness that he's complaining a little bit about with Degas. But the other one is much broader in its handling and more masses of color, and it's quite different. It's much more generalized in its treatment, and I put it up next to another painting with lots of people mounted on horses, which is a battle scene. So again, reminding us that Degas is showing a really weird moment in a modern entertainment. That's a lot of backsides of horses, right? It's not like the finish line or something super exciting. It's a pretty haphazard kind of moment, not this, grand battle kind of scene. And also, this really throws into relief how much more detail someone like Meissonier is giving, and Degas something much more generalized. And in fact, when Degas went to the races, which he didn't bring his canvases and paint there. He might make a little sketch, but he was storing his memories to bring home to his studio. But he passed a pair of binoculars to his companion at the races, and when those binoculars were handed back to him, Degas nudged his companion and said, "It was kind of like looking at a Meissonier, right?" I say this not to be mean, although it's a little bit mean. But this sense that he's thinking about how we see, and we don't see like that without the aid of binoculars. Maybe we see more like that in real life, in the sort of passing moments and experience of entertainments. And so this sense that Impressionism challenges our expectations about composition, about ways of seeing, and it gets us to reconsider how we see, what we see, where we see it, and perhaps Impressionism informs our own lens of looking at the world around us, the way that Monet was seeing the world around him through the lens of works of art that he admired. Degas loved to make sketches. He also loved to take a work of art and have that work of art sometimes function as the jumping off point for another work of art. So I have the MFA's oil painting on the screen next to a pastel that's in the collection of the Thyssen. And you can hopefully quickly see that this looks very unposed and composed, right? Lots of horses' bottoms. But then you see that certain of the figures are repurposed, certain of the groupings are repurposed much, much later in another composition. So this making of the paintings in the studio and then the reusing of motifs from one work of art to the next. So even when it looks or feels unposed and uncomposed, it really is quite composed. I'm going to step out of my lane for just a second. I know that there's a conservation lecture coming up in a couple of weeks, but I couldn't resist showing you this X-ray because it's an MFA painting and I have this X-ray so that you can also see, I know X-rays are super hard to look at. Whoa. So again, reinforcing that sense of Degas posing and composing a work of art on the canvas, making changes. So even though this might look like something casually observed, quickly observed, its own layers, its objecthood reveals a bit of his working process when we have special vision to look at it. Another thing that Degas was acclaimed for by certain critics was his way of making portraits. And so I offer you these family portraits and the words of a critic, Edmond Duranty, who wrote an essay called La Nouvelle Peinture, the New Painting, in 1876, coincident with that second Impressionist exhibition. And he doesn't name Degas when he's talking about what makes a modern portrait modern and great, but he is definitely talking about Degas. And he says, no longer will we separate the individual from the background of his apartment or the street. Never in our existence does he appear to us against a neutral, empty, vague background. Instead, there are furnishings, chimneys, wall hangings around him, an interior which expresses his fortune, his class, his métier. And so you see these people in their characteristic poses, even slightly out of focus as they move in interiors that are clearly familiar to them, enjoying a pastime that is pleasurable for them, this way of showing someone in their most characteristic way. This picture, too, is a portrait, in fact, of Degas' friend Paul Valpinson with his wife, the wet nurse, and their son Henri, in addition to being a Jean Racine at the races. So these kinds of modern portraits, which are, less posed looking or might be really dense and difficult in their psychological weightiness, and they're works of art of people he knows well and he studies closely, but ultimately they don't give themselves away. We end up looking at them and sort of feeling intensely without knowing all the answers. And for me, anyway, that's these people always remain a bit at a distance from me in their psychology, and that modern sensibility of how well can we ever really know someone else anyway is always there in the the looking for me at these particular paintings. I also offer onto you that, like with the jockeys, with Degas, art generates art, that Degas' work is always a studio art, whether it's a sketch or another finished painting that Degas uses and continues to create and innovate and think. And I am your lecturer next week as well, so I can tell you that that's an idea we'll delve into much further next time with Degas' pastels. So in closing, I want to just say that we began today with what might have felt like the seemingly simple surface of Impressionism and moved into greater depth with works that might challenge or complicate those initial impressions of Impressionism. Thank you.
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and we have microphones on either side that we can get to you.
Hi, thank you. I wonder if there are any principles that are known determining the decisions about cropping. A lot of times figures are cut off.
Sorry, principles?
Yeah, determining the cropping decisions.
I mean, artist's choice, and certainly in many cases, I could have shown a lot more Japanese woodblock prints. So often the cropping is something that they're seeing there. Placing a pole or something in the center of a composition. Degas does that frequently as something he's admiring in Japanese woodblock prints as well. And then I think also the sort of strangeness of some of the cropping is to reinforce this notion of something being uncomposed, something being casually observed. And even when we know that it's not, even when we know that it's a studio painting, if you crop something unexpectedly, it makes it feel momentary, it makes it feel spontaneous, and also gives the sense that it's a slice of a life that's being seen, a slice of something being seen further beyond the confines of that canvas, rather than being bracketed in with trees on either side to sort of hold it together like a conventional composition. Some of the sort of casualness of composition, certainly we could think about with photography, which we also have to keep in mind doesn't do sort of snapshots at that point. So a person walking through a scene as someone's taking a photo wouldn't appear as a sort of cut-off figure in a scenic photograph. So certainly, and I didn't bring images today, Degas was interested in photographs, and some of the ways in which his portraits are posed and composed look very much like the way a daguerreotype or a carte de visite might be posed and composed. And valorizing the changing city was certainly also something that photographers were commissioned to photograph Paris as Paris is changing from its windy streets with cobblestones to the broad boulevards. So that sensibility of employing photography in the service of modernity is very, very much in the spirit of what we're talking about here. But technically speaking, getting a figure to crop like that isn't technically possible yet. Yeah. All right.
I have a question about Monet at Giverny. When I visited some years ago, I was really quite taken with the Japanese block prints. There were so many of them, and I asked about them. And then the guide said that the fishmonger with whom Monet did business frequently wrapped fish with these prints. And I was really quite struck with that. And I wondered if that was true.
There are many tales of Japanese woodblock prints being used as packing materials. I have not heard the fishmonger one before. I have heard of other objects coming wrapped up, and instead of like we would use newspaper, the wrapping was a woodblock print, and that was how an artist discovered them to begin with. And I think of them as tales, in part because we also know that by the 1860s, there are major shops in Paris, and Monet's in his 20s when that's happening. So having the fishmonger wrapping his purchases in woodblock prints so many decades later, at the point that he would be in Giverny, would be a surprise for sure. How was that for diplomatic?
Hi, how is it determined who could display at the Impressionist exhibits? Was it anyone, or?
They got in a lot of fights about that. They were quite open, and they would invite their friends, and fairly frequently Degas would invite artists that some of the other painters didn't really like. So it's when I made that slide and I had just the sort of major names on the slide, I thought maybe I should make a second slide with some of the names that are unfamiliar but who showed with the Impressionists, because it's not just the usual suspects that we think about now. And then additionally, there are names that are quite familiar now that you might be surprised when I tell you they showed with the Impressionists. So somebody like Gauguin showed with the Impressionists. Somebody like Odilon Redon, that beautiful floral still life that's in the pastel exhibition, he showed with the Impressionists once. So some artists who are, still really well-known names, we just don't associate them with Impressionism, did show in the Impressionist exhibitions. And then other artists who you probably have never heard of, Raffaelli, for example, were also showing with them. So it was a bit at invitation, and then a sort of conversation would be a polite way of describing the way that the organizers dealt with this. And they took turns, dealing with who was going to be really the kind of driving force behind finding the venue and doing the hang and making the pamphlet and all that kind of stuff.
So I wondered why you didn't mention Monet, because he was certainly a major figure at the time.
He is a bit older than the Impressionists, and an artist that they very much admired and knew quite well. He sometimes painted with them or painted them, in fact, but he never exhibited with them. He was invited, but he did not exhibit with them. He continued to exhibit at the Salon, even with terrible criticism, but at the Salon. He also, ultimately, he was represented by Paul Durand-Ruel, who was the dealer, who also would represent the Impressionists. So he's very much part of their circle, and I did think about including him, but decided instead to focus on the ones who showed together.
Any more questions? That's it.
If you're feeling shy, you can ask me a question up here.